So today I'm going to focus on doctoral research and then explore material that was selected from the Stasi Archive in Berlin as part of the study. So this is a really nice opportunity. I wanted to thank Alessandro and Helen and Yanis for the invitation and for hosting me. It's really great to be here. And it's really nice to be able to look in depth at this archival material, which quite often I don't have time to do. And as part of doctoral study, it functioned in a different way. So I want to look at the idiosyncrasies of the archive and experience of researching within an archive and making sense of some of the material. And having listened to some of the talks yesterday, it's really apparent the amount of care that's embedded into archival practices. And I don't just mean the material decisions and ethical decisions, but also the interaction and personal relationships in that interaction through tangible material. So the research title for my doctorate is Special Operations Deploying Artists' Methods to Investigate Surveillance. As artists, we observe, gather data, analyse and reinterpret, and we could think of that as a surveillance practice in itself. So the study then asked what I might find out if I used arts methods to look back at surveillance. And as practitioners who specialise in vision and interpretation, artists are acutely aware of the effect that new technologies have on the ways in which we see and are able to look. And this is particularly true of technologies centred on visioning. The material qualities of the image offer a framework within arts practice to understand operations of power through the technologies that produce them. Surveillance practice generates vast image archives, and I include behavioural data as part of image making. And AI, of course, relies on surveillance data. But today I'm going to be concentrating on the analogue. So before I started doctoral research, I was a bit obsessed with these surveillance devices at the Stasi Museum in Berlin. I was intrigued that although they were really once high-tech in their time, and I wanted to see the material that they produced. I was intrigued about whether there'd be the rustle of the sleeve cuff in the audio of a watch or the scribe of the pen on the paper, and what would an image from a camera hidden in a tie look like? What might its point of view be? But I was also aware that these devices that look comical and sculptural hold this really uncomfortable tension because they once supported one of the most effective and brutal surveillance regimes ever to have existed. But it also emphasises that information does not rely on high tech, being high resolution, being high spec, or from height. And are they that much different from today's smart technologies embedded within domestic appliances, collecting behavioural data like the smart Hoover, television, or meter, or the footage from doorbell cameras? So to carry the study forward, I decided to use historical spy cameras and dictaphones during the debate and passage of the Investigatory Powers Bill through the UK Houses of Parliament. And then after that, I put in a request to look at archival material from hidden cameras at the Stasi Records Agency in Berlin. And at the time, the Investigatory Powers Act was new digital surveillance legislation that would bring up to date, but also significantly extend the UK's digital surveillance capabilities. It's what Snowden described as the most far-reaching blanket surveillance of any Western democracy is what it would enable. So I bought this 1960s Minox spy camera and this 1980s dictaphone from eBay, and over 8 months I observed the debates in the House of Lords and the House of Commons during the final stages of the bill. And each sitting would last between 8 and 12 hours long, so I spent a lot of time hanging out in the viewing gallery and in and around the Houses of Parliament. But I also took strange cameras and toys with me through the security checks, which are like airport baggage style checks. So this I Spy ball, you can roll it on the floor and it records about 30 seconds of audio. So these kind of toys and props and cameras allowed me to explore the edges of privacy, of civil liberties, to grapple with ethical complexities, and also think about the kind of, I suppose, ethical considerations that often I had to respond to on the hoof. But it also made me think about what it meant to capture and document. So these are some samples of audio, and this is Black Rod's footsteps on an I Spy ball, and he's the Sergeant-in-Arms of the Houses of Parliament, who is the head of security. And this is the division bell. This is the bell that rings throughout the Houses of Parliament, but it also rings within local pubs and also some of the residents around Westminster where MPs live. And it's calling MPs to vote. So this warped, uncomfortable, poor quality, undecipherable samples of samples was also kind of reflected in the images that I produced. So the Minox takes photographs on tiny negatives, so the images are very grainy. It's got this really retrospective feel of the analog film, these lovely colour casts that you get. And you also get these half snippets of information as my camera's held in my pocket. As I'm moving swiftly in low light, there's a blur of long exposure. So this series of images was taken on the first sitting of Parliament after the Brexit vote, the day that Prime Minister David Cameron delivered his resignation speech. And outside there was a protest in support of Jeremy Corbyn as 27 members of the Shadow Cabinet resigned in one day. There was also this choir in the Houses of Parliament being recorded by the BBC. I'm just going to... So I was building up this record of material through audio and photographs, not really knowing what I was capturing, and overlaying them and using these in anticipation of exhibition.
The light switch is automatic. To lock the door, turn the handle upwards. The toilet is on the wall facing you. The emergency pull cord is in front on the right of the toilet when seated. The toilet tissue, when seated, is on the right. The sanitary box is usually to the left of the toilet when seated. The cistern is low level. The toilet flush is a lever on the right. The wash basin is on the right-hand wall from the toilet when seated. There is a single lever tap. The soap dispenser is above the basin. It is manually operated. The paper towels are above the basin.
So there was this nice moment when I compared my microphone with that of the BBC's, and I think their quality was a bit better than mine, but I began to really like this warp of the tape and this kind of the way it distorted the choir singers. And I was not really knowing what I was going to do with this material. But it was a way of exploring the space and meeting people and talking to people. But I also took books with me as I went into both the Houses of Parliament and the Stasi Archives. So The First Circle by Solzhenitsyn came into Parliament, Stasi-Land by Anna Funder as I travelled in Berlin, and Orwell's 1984 as I looked at archival material, but also other contemporary authors. These literary ghosts fed into my thoughts, and as time went on, I began to look through the protagonists' eyes. Their narratives made sense of the contemporary debate or revealed details in the archival material. I also wanted to capture the experiences, charged atmospheres, histories and testimonies of people I spoke to. I wrote diaries that skipped between time zones, included personal accounts, Twitter feeds, governmental reports, conversations with archivists, policemen or the general public, and included passages from fiction. So as I'm presenting, I'm kind of dipping in and out of these diary accounts, so the flows will shift and sometimes I get the tenses wrong. These processes emphasise to me the constructed nature of knowledge production, or sways of influence, and the idiosyncrasies, rhythms, repetitions, and overlaps of power. So the study fell into this 5 explosive years in UK politics. It was a particularly strange and unprecedented time. I started the observation 2 weeks before the Brexit vote, and the week before Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered by a far-right extremist. The study continued through the huge political turmoil for years after the vote. It ran alongside Donald Trump's presidency, but more importantly, I was really involved with it as the Cambridge Analytica scandal was exposed by investigative journalist Carol Cadwallader from The Guardian, and also the Panorama from Channel 4. And that was concerning the use of Facebook data that was employed in both Trump's and the Brexit campaign. And then whilst I wrote the conclusion, the COVID pandemic kicked in. But I think it's important and useful to remember this context, especially following the recent riots and attack on asylum hotels and lawyers in the UK. And during this time, this period of the study, we saw very real challenges to democratic process. And we also experienced deep divisions societally. We witnessed the increasing confidence of the far right, exacerbated by our parliamentary leaders and public figures, fueled by social media and the press. And the ways in which we were governed within Parliament, I saw this shift as Boris Johnson just got rid of all the traditional Conservatives, and there was a real shift in Parliament to the right. We also, immediately after the vote, saw a 5-fold increase in racist attacks, and there was a sharp increase on attacks on MPs and journalists. So I was following these posts on social media and watching this endless stream of breaking news on Facebook and Twitter, and seeing this kind of overload of information, disinformation unfold, and watching the debate travel from verbatim onto screens, onto parliamentary TV, out into the building and into the press. And I also began to become more aware and witness the growing confidence of the far right and their digital strategies on social media becoming more organised. All of this was happening as I was examining the decommissioned archive of a former dictatorship. At the time, the Stasi Records Agency in 2016 was not yet part of the archives in Berlin. It's now part of the National Archives. The agency was the first institution worldwide to make Secret Service files publicly accessible. And this was in response to the demands made by citizens of the former GDR during the peaceful revolution of '89. So the Film and Video Archive is housed within the original headquarters of the Ministry for State Security. So archival research takes place in its original container using the same cataloguing system as the Stasi. And this has a particular effect on your experience as a researcher. It emphasizes this kind of successful overthrow of a dictatorship, and you're aware of this feeling that you've somehow infiltrated this oppressive body of power. And also, alongside that, a lot of the staff at the agency had lived under the SED, the East German Communist Party. So there was this real sense in pride and privilege of continuing the revolutionary work of civilian resistance, as well as shock and ridicule at what they discovered. So the archive houses, and I was thinking, I think, Alessandro, you were talking about the brilliance of archivists knowing all their material really well. But the Stasi Archive houses 111 kilometres of documents, with 50 kilometres of them held in the central office. There are 12 regional offices. The audiovisual material holds nearly 2 million photographs, microfilms and slides, 3,000 films and videos, 23,000 audio recordings and 54 Stasi data projects, as well as this resource of sabotaged material, which is what this image is of. So as the revolution unfolded, agents began destroying material, burning, shredding, cutting and sabotaging files, prompting citizens to occupy the building. So archivists began to have got, I can't remember how many, it's on the slide, yeah, 16,000 bags still remain to be fixed back together and these documents to examine, and that's work that's still ongoing. But there was also archival material so the agents left the building so fast that there'd be drawers that held things like socks and love letters and half-eaten sandwiches. And the archivists joked that they couldn't keep the sandwiches because they couldn't put a water stamp on them. So as I approached this, I obviously had to create some parameters of the type of material that I wanted to look at. And as an artist, that was quite hard to do, because I wanted to work responsively, to follow my nose, resist evidence gathering for a specific outcome. I requested to access footage from hidden cameras that had failed, was sabotaged, damaged, or missed its subject, or footage that revealed more about the situation of the documentation itself. I didn't really want to reenact an invasion of privacy. I wasn't interested per se in the subject matter, but wanted to look at the material qualities of the footage, images and files. So the governance of the Stasi files and archival material is defined by the Stasi Records Act of 1991, and the legislation has three main purposes. The primary purpose is to allow individuals to access information stored by the Stasi about them so they can understand the impact and influence that the surveillance has had on their lives. Secondly, the law aims to protect personal rights, preventing a second invasion of privacy or repression through the use of the archival material. And thirdly, the law ensures and promotes legal, historical and political analysis of the Stasi's activities. And at the Records Agency, you're given a dedicated archivist to work with you for the duration of your research. And I was lucky because I really got on with the archivist and they kept my file open for 5 years. So they prepare and order material delivered by courier from regional offices. And then we review the sample together and they suggest other material. There's a language barrier and sometimes I worked with a translator. And the request resulted in training material, sabotage material, pictures for the development of new surveillance devices, images from hidden cameras alongside explainers on how to use them and where they were taken, as well as original surveillance footage. So the material is documented on different cameras and films, often hacked and adapted, analog and digital, both which has gone through different stages of telecine, digitization, transcoding since 1991. And cataloguing is ongoing. It's a live archive. People are still revisiting their files, but they're also still, discovering and reviewing material because there is so much of it. And as the surveillance files are turned into archival material, the files expose the speed of technological advance through the changing quality and choice of digital codecs and resolutions for preservation, as well as the changing fonts and typeface. It really exposed the kind of limited resource within the archive, but also the lack of resource that the Stasi were operating with. So I'm going to explore some of the material that I selected. And like I said, I might dip in and out of diary. I didn't call it diary writing, I called them debriefs as I go through some of the material, so there might be a bit a different flow intents. So the first two films is archival footage from the 70s of agents learning how to use briefcase cameras. This was some of the first footage I looked at. So the archivist described this, and a lot of the footage, a lot of the training material, as learning by doing. A lot of the technology was smuggled from the West, and so quite often there weren't any handbooks. So agents would learn through trial and error, and also create vast amounts of training material for other agents. This footage also reveals a series of hand signals used to communicate with other agents. You can see this on the left-hand screen. It's a bit burnt out there. So you'll see techniques such as framing, point of view, pan, tilt, focus, depth of field being practiced. The figures, there's kind of silhouettes, so calibration charts. They've got a tonal range as well as numbers for focusing. So some cameras are positioned on the ground with an open camera on a tripod. So an open camera just means you can see it. Some are within briefcases. Some are within a nesting box from height. At one point, as I was looking at this footage, the VHS tape that it had been put on a VHS tape by the Stasi. So they'd telecined it onto a VHS tape, but that VHS tape had then been used to put into a camera to carry out some surveillance of an individual. So there's this real layering within all the material of different uses and time zones. So in this complex and unsettling footage, I recognise creative freedom and exploration informed by my early learning and the work of my students. I recognise the seduction of technology, technique and processes, and I can see the playful experimentation and the japing about to act as subject matter. I'm aware of the faults, scratches, cuts, the points at which the camera has been opened, and the layering of processes or repair work. Through the material itself, these images bear witness to political change, this time one of resistance. The fact that we are seeing Secret Service material at all is witness to resistance. Literature extracts also help me to decipher the footage. In the book Stasiland, Anna Funder collects testimonies from both victims and perpetrators of the regime 2 years after the revolution in '89. She describes entering one of the former regional offices and seeing a document revealing the hand signals of agents. Large and small mysteries were accounted for when the files were opened, not least perhaps the tics of the ordinary man in the street. This document was on display. Signals for observation. 1, watch out, subject is coming. Touch nose with hand or handkerchief. 2, subject is moving on, going further, or overtaking. Stroke hair with hand, or raise hat briefly. 3, subject is standing still. Lay one hand on back or on the stomach. 4, observing agent wishes to terminate observation because cover threatened. Bend and retie shoelaces. 5, subject returning, both hands against back or on stomach. And 6, observing agent wishes to speak with team leader or other observing agents. Take out briefcase or equivalent and examine contents. Whilst I reviewed the film in the original offices, the archivist told me to look out of the window and get my camera. In the space below, between two tall buildings, there was a large black Audi and men in suits and suitcases. So, not suitcases, and shades. They were contemporary German state agents on a training day. This area within a government building would not be visible to the general public. So whilst I was at the archive, I'd also take photos on my Minux, but it was always on an open camera. So this is a series of images there, and the bottom right-hand image is of the Supreme Court, which is where the Investigatory Powers Act was being challenged by Liberty, and they had to change some of the legislation. So this is also footage of an agent learning by doing, learning how to use a video camera. The process of choosing failed footage or empty footage was intriguing for the archivists, but it created this space for conversation about the material, about the work of the archive, but also personal testimony of their experience of living in former East Berlin.
Na, die Röhre scheint schon ziemlich fertig zu sein, weißt du?
Na, aber wenn du lieber kippst, sieht schöner aus. Hab ich jedenfalls festgestellt letztens.
Wieso ist denn das so schlecht?
So throughout the research, I was trying to define art's methods, thinking about performative processes and the crossover between artists, agents, and investigative journalists. Laura Poitras, who made the documentary on Snowden called Citizen 4, describes the work of investigative journalists as expanding the public and presented narrative that can seem fixed and authoritative. So she uses the metaphor of an accordion. The work of investigative journalists consider the spaces before and after and in between the collapsed folds of the bellows, so there's this expanse of information. But it also made me think about the concertina of the archival file, as well as the expanded frame of the image. Quite often, the training footage is that, I can't work out whether that's on the tape or outside. The training footage involves those of us who are used to analog film. When we finish the end of a film, we'll take photos of our friends or inside the office or our pets. There's quite a lot of photos of guinea pigs. And, but also, footage in the offices of other archives, of other agents, sorry. I began to recognise agents across different footage, and the archivist then made connections between the files that I began to map. So this looks like that's a photographic enlarger in the Stasi archive. Oh, sorry, the Stasi offices. But I would also come across cataloguing errors. So this series, when I asked to look at negatives, and I was given these just piles of negative files, and so I took them out and just looked at them on a light box with a tiny magnifier. So it's quite difficult to see what the subject matter was. But it didn't matter to me so much because I was more interested in this vignetting of the briefcase camera or the buttonhole camera, and this. The way the fix hasn't quite worked on these colour negatives suggests that they were hand processed. But also these negatives, the bottom strip I found it divorced from its numerical running order. It was 200 images away from where it should be. And that's because the Stasi hacked cameras and altered devices so that they could bulk load film, so that they could take over 200 images at a time. So the surveillance images would often be, and you can see in this series, they were, literally every, 20 seconds maybe, a huge amount. If we think, we're used to that with digital cameras, but with analog cameras, that's a huge amount of imagery to be taking and then to be processing. So looking at these negatives created these conversations about how to physically create the workflow for my request, because I think quite often people coming in, selecting an image, wanting it digitized, pay €5, but I wanted whole strips of images and I wanted them at really high resolution because I was thinking of artifacts. So it created this massive headache for the digital archivist, and we spent a lot of time unpicking kind of the process that we might use to do it. But it meant that I was invited into the labs, shown the mothballed dark rooms, and had longer conversations about the material, and we unpicked the analogue processes, faults and workflows. And in the end, a business case was made for new equipment to copy the negatives. So again, these encounters, exchanges, conversations became an important part of the research and understanding the work of the archive and the substance of the material that I was looking at. And when I was choosing material, so I was predominantly led by my instinct as an artist, but I sometimes selected material because of the story behind it. But I also allowed myself to be guided by the archivist. So I chose these negatives because they had been so thoroughly cut to pieces. So the cut lines across the image too, those kind of diagonal black marks. So yeah, we had a long conversation about how to copy these, how to document them so that I could use them. But it also opened this conversation about where one image ended and another began, and how do we charge for this? Do we charge for one image, half an image, a series of images, or one neg strip? And what did I say that these images turned out to be Gorbachev's state visit in 1986 to East Berlin. And when I was looking at the imagery, I began to recognise the work of skilled and experienced agents as opposed to the trial and error of those learning. So good agents will get the framing right, it's in focus, the exposure's good, it's been developed well in the lab. And with film work, there's not a huge amount of movement with the briefcase camera. And often the images would turn round, they'd go upside down, but it didn't matter which way up the negative is, so long as the subject is captured. But it was quite unusual to look at upside down negatives. And I kind of bolstered this learning by taking part in an undercover camera training course at the Centre of Investigative Journalism at Goldsmiths, which taught us technique and using buttonhole cameras, but also had a whole day on the ethical implications of using hidden cameras. So the video material was also sabotaged, and this is looking down into an office, and the archivist said that a magnet had been run over tapes. I'm not quite sure that could have made it so deteriorated evenly. Anyway, I'll play a bit. But I think in this footage, I like the circle and the audio best.
Das fand ich auch geschrieben. Das ist das Wichtigste. Das Wichtigste ist dann nächste Woche zum Eigenuntersuchung kommt.
Hier im Hause.
So it was hard not to be. I talk about the seduction of the footage I'm looking at, and I'm aware I'm using words like, and it's uncomfortable, and the archivist would abruptly bring me back down to earth and remind me of the footage that I was looking at and the content, which made it more important for me to try and avoid subject matter, and so that I could really focus on the beyond and around the frame rather than what is in frame itself. So I did actually ask for, with this footage, I asked for footage where I gave a time code where the person left the room, and when they came back in, I cut it. But I had to make quite firm requests because it was unusual requests. Sometimes the archivist didn't believe that I actually wanted the bit where there was nothing in the footage or nothing there, or where it would have just failed. So I wouldn't always get what I wanted. My concern was predominantly to reveal more about the people, politics and power at play behind the camera, beyond and around the edges of the frame. And then on one of my visits, they said, we've got this new film for you that's just been remastered. And this is the control room of scientist Robert Haverman under house arrest. So this was a film that had been cut to pieces. The archivist was really, really pleased because they'd done this seamless edit. It was perfect. All the cut marks had been totally eradicated and taken out. And when they delivered it to their boss, they were told they had to redo it, put all the cut marks back in to maintain the provenance of the material. So there's these complicated decisions regarding the way in which material is represented to maintain its historical context, what Susan Shupley would call a material witness. So when I viewed material in the archive, it was always without anonymization. But on release, it would have a pixelation filter. So this agent isn't anonymized because no agents under the Stasi Records Act are granted that privacy. They are exposed, they aren't anonymised. But there's parts of the legislation say that unless they're on a dinner break or with their family, for instance, when they're off duty, and same for kind of the state police who feature in some of the footage. And these are a selection of images scanned from a file demonstrating the use and cost and potential of an analog buttonhole camera hidden within a suit with a quick release cable. So this image then holds these two time zones from historical surveillance material to archival material made present by the digital filter. And it's also indicating a protection of privacy for those under surveillance. Although the archivist suggested that a lot of the subjects in this footage were quite often agents modelling for other agents to demonstrate the camera use. And sometimes this is apparent by the proximity of the subject. And this is an example of a file. And this is one from a series of about 6 pictures I selected. So pictures from agents to the state to develop new devices to carry out surveillance. And this one's for a camera hidden in a glove. But there were also pictures for a camera hidden in a basket of mushrooms, a motorbike, a dress, a bra, a shirt, and a series of bags. Also, a kind of failed file of a lens that could photograph around corners, followed by examples with example images taken with the device in the proposal. The pictures began to remind me of artist funding or commission bids. They contain a written proposal, a description of the process, technique, a budget, notes on the aperture, shutter speed, with illustrative shots and sample documentation. There's also this hack of technology, objects and clothing to enable change of use, all made within limited resources and funding. And if the pitch was accepted and therefore funded, the proposer had a certain amount of creative freedom to develop the technique and device, albeit with the authorization and employment of the dictatorship. So there's just 2 final films. So over the kind of, I can't remember how many visits it was. It's probably about 5, I think, but over a period of 5 years. There were 2 films that the archivist returned me to on each visit, even though I'd rejected them. We went back and viewed these files again, and I was kind of puzzled by this, but went with the flow. And yeah, so let me carry on. So one of them is, they're both filmed in 1989, just before the breakdown of communism and at the height of surveillance in the GDR. So it wasn't really material that I felt comfortable with, as they directly represented a Stasi operation where you're placed alongside the agent's point of view as a viewer, and this felt uncomfortable and voyeuristic. So at first I resisted selecting them. I couldn't anticipate how I could work with this footage in a way that felt right, but I recognised that it was important as well as violent documentation, and that I felt like I had some responsibility to grapple with this material that was problematic and that was not necessarily aesthetic in its abstraction. I ended up buying all of it. So the first is a protest on Alexanderplatz on the 7th of September in 1989 that took place following the rigged elections in May of that year, and that's what this footage is. So these files were presented to me as 6 separate videos. They're filmed from fixed cameras on hotel skyscrapers and several hidden cameras on civilians, alongside open cameras on the ground around the World Trade Clock. And when I was reviewing this footage, I began to notice moments when cameras were filming the same thing, and it was normally when somebody was arrested, all the cameras would go to that person. When I say arrested, sometimes it'd be showing an identity card and questioning, but more often than not, people were carried away by their hands and feet amidst tourists and visitors to the square. So what I did was I used the time code to any place in the camera where there'd been a pause in filming, I replaced with real time a black gap. So they all became the length of the entire footage. And then I synchronized them so they were frame perfect. So the entire sequence is, I think, 2.5 hours long. Don't worry, you haven't got to watch it all.
Wer frei ist, braucht nicht fliehen. Jetzt sind wir weiter hier. Ich möchte schon endlich wissen, zu meinem Persönlichkeitsrecht gehört, denke ich, alles das hier. Ja? Ich habe frei anscheinend und stehe. Ich möchte auch frei sein. Leben und frei sein. Freie Meinungsäußerung, geht in Verhandlung stehen. Und das ist meine Meinung. Und ich jetzt werd nachher gefragt.
So the first major demonstration against electoral fraud occurred on the 7th of June in 1989, and protests followed monthly across the Eastern Bloc. Demonstrators could not protest overtly in the GDR, as they would immediately be arrested. They gathered en masse in the square, so it was a kind of undercover demonstration. Tourists and visitors did not have any idea or took no notice of the surveillance operation, as arrests were being taken place and people were being carried away. The focus was also on a West German camera team who were trying to film the protests and arrests from a nearby car park. There are so many agents on the ground that there is mass confusion. Neither the agents nor the protesters know who was working for the Stasi and who are working for the Western media. On the ground, agents talk to people to try and identify and incriminate the protesters. Occasionally, the Stasi display their ID cards and individuals are charged. Undercover agents block the camera's view, believing they're blocking the Western media, when they are in fact blocking the Stasi open camera on the ground. At the end of the day, over 100 protesters have been arrested and put onto buses, handcuffed and filmed, shouting, "We want out." And this was just a couple of months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in this sequence, sometimes there's just one camera rolling, sometimes there's all six, sometimes there's moments of synchronization, and then the cameras fall away. And this, so I gave this back to the archive so that they could see this panopticon view that they hadn't seen before of this footage. So I'll move on to the second and last film. The second film that we revisited on each visit to the archive was this 1980s surveillance of people going to an underground punk gig held in a church. The surveillance takes place inside a trabant, is claustrophobic, and you adapt to their point of view. After sustained viewing, you have the sensation that you want to get out. The archivist translates the content and dialogue of the agents using Google Translate, odd words that we know, and we mime and muddle through. There's a mix of enjoyment and nostalgia, but also sadness and upset as we watch. Over time, more details of their personal knowledge of the content is revealed. In some ways, the archivist is revisiting their youth. During one viewing of the footage, I'm reminded of a passage in 1984 where the main protagonist, Winston, seeks out one of the proles in a pub. He's searching for truth. He wants testimony from someone who remembers the past, as any evidence at the Ministry of Truth was being destroyed or rewritten, and Winston had to carry out this destruction himself. History was becoming uncertain in his own mind. Over several viewings of this footage, Punks, I became aware that I was not only viewing the footage through the archivist's eyes, but also through Winston's eyes. Winston's quest for truth revealed something about the archivist's experience when revisiting the film. This was personal and actual evidence of life before the revolution, retrieved material marked for destruction. Over time, the footage became more and more troublesome to watch. As we spotted more details in the films, we both developed a different kind of objectivity when looking at the footage. And I became aware that not only was I looking through the archivist's eyes and Winston's eyes, but that the archivist had begun to look through mine. And I'm just going to play out with the band that was playing.